Hey guys, what's good? Derek here from Bomb Socks, back with another day of Bomb Bites, where we feast upon the words of Christ one bite at a time. So I want to continue kind of where we started yesterday with this idea of consolation. We read in chapter 1 about how Jesus Christ is the consolation. Consolation is what you get when you don't get what you originally wanted with this. When Paul went on his mission, I think he experienced a lot of things that were in fact, I know this, very, very difficult things. And you kind of get a glimpse into that in these early chapters of 2 Corinthians as he's writing to the Corinthian saints. He uses a very, very unique phrase here in verse number 8 of chapter 1. For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. Now that's a powerful statement right there, this idea of being pressed out of measure. Now, as I was thinking about this, it's kind of like this idea of here's where you are measured. This is where you are comfortable being measured. And you are pressed out of measure, meaning you're way over there. It's like this idea here of here's your comfort zone, right? And you and I love to be in our comfort zones. When we're stepping out of our comfort zones, that's where it becomes very difficult. But as you see here, it says this is where the magic also happens. Even though it's difficult, anybody who serves a mission understands the concept. Here's your comfort zone. And what happens is you get thrown pretty far outside of your comfort zone. So this idea of being pressed out of measure, even that we despaired even of life, meaning the life that we are used to and the life that we are comfortable with, we're so far out of that and it is so difficult. Now, as I was searching this, I was studying through this idea of being pressed out of measure. I actually found a poem that was written out there. It's a Christian poem and it's simply titled Pressed Out of Measure. And here's the words to it. I thought it was kind of interesting. Pressed out of measure and pressed to all length, pressed so intently it seems beyond strength, pressed in the body and pressed in the soul, pressed in the mind till the dark surges roll, pressure by foe and pressure from friends, pressure on pressure till life nearly ends. Again, you're like, what a depressing poem, right? But it shows you, and I think many of us are certainly familiar with this idea of what happens when you are thrown way out of your comfort zone. So with that in mind, question for you. So as you are being pressed out of measure, what then are you being pressed into? Now, Paul, back in the book of Acts 18, it says, when Silas and Timotheus were from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, this poem that I found actually has a second part to it. Now, when you're pressed out of measure, you are pressed into certain things. Look at this. Pressed into knowing no helper but God. Pressed into loving the staff and the rod. I love that reference back to Psalm 23, the great shepherd's psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, the staff and the rod. Pressed into liberty where nothing clings. Pressed into faith for impossible things. How cool is that? Pressed into living a life in the Lord. Pressed into living a Christ life outpoured. So that's one of the things to remember. I think this is a message for any one of us who are feeling right now way pressed out of measure. When you're pressed out of measure, you are then pressed into something else. And this can be one of those moments where you find yourself driven to your knees in adversity and you find yourself growing from these experiences. Again, just because you're having the trial doesn't necessarily mean you are guaranteed growth from it, but that's something you have to look at. And it's a mindset you got to change. Now, one of the cool things about this poem is it actually is a song. I found this. Now, it's a Christian song. It's in Christian hymn books out there called Pressed Out of Measure. Now, I looked it up a little bit. I didn't really care for the tune too much. I mean, some of you might look it up and it's just fine. Personally, I just didn't like the tune as much. I do love the words. And so I was looking through our own hymn book as far as a meter that goes with it. And there's one hymn that actually goes really nicely with it. And the hymn is Be Still My Soul, which again, the words are very similar in both of these, or at least the same idea. One of the things you could do, and I'm not going to do this for you here, but one of the things you could do, and I've done this with seminary classes, I've done it with Sunday school classes, I've done it with large EFY groups before, where we've actually sung this song. And again, it's the tune of Be Still My Soul, but you put it together like that and it really works very nicely. In fact, the chorus, which you can have after every verse, God is my hope and God is my joy. He is the resurrection I enjoy. Now that idea comes back from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, if you continue this idea in verse 9. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God which raiseth the dead. So they're like, hey, we might have been thrown into death situations and we did not trust ourselves, but we trusted in God, who, verse 10, delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. And I love that, how here we are. We're out of measure. We're over here. We're going to trust that God will continue to deliver us. Now, you see the same idea continued as you go over to chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians. And again, there's so many verses all through these chapters that deal with adversity. You look at verses about 6 through 10 of chapter 4. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. And I love these verses so much. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. Always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our body. You go down to verses 15 through 18, and this is a great place to finish this idea. For all things are for your sakes, that the abundant grace might through the thanksgiving of many redound to the glory of God. All things is a high percentage of things. All the difficulties that you're going through are for your sakes. There's very much through here Romans chapter 8 vibe to it, where all things work together for good to them that love God, for which cause we faint not. But though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. I love that. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. You remember how it talked about in Romans 8, how I reckon that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And that's kind of what happens when you're pressed out of measure. You're so far away of what you are used to. So that's got to be the mindset that you and I keep when we are pressed out of measure, is we've got to look and see, how is this going to give us a greater eternal weight of glory? This light affliction for a moment, it's going to work in us a greater Christ-like type of life. And so I love this idea of being pressed out of measure. I mean, I don't know if I love the idea of it, but I do appreciate this idea of, as you are pressed out of measure, you are pressed into a life that is going to be more Christ-like, and you can become more like him. I love that message, and I think it's very relevant for our lives. I'm grateful for it, and I know it's true. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks as always for sharing. As always, we're so grateful that you do that. If you haven't already, please go check out our amazingly comfortable gospel themed socks at bombsocks.com. Godspeed, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.